The story of the disappearing village of Anjikuni Lake is one of the most famous mystery tales from Canada. It is often told as a frightening incident where an entire Inuit village vanished overnight without any explanation. People say that houses were left open, food was still cooking, tools were untouched, and even graves were disturbed. Over the years, this story has been shared in books, newspapers, documentaries, and on the internet. Many people still wonder whether this incident really happened or whether it is only a legend. To understand the truth, we need to look carefully at where the story came from, what was actually reported, and what historians later discovered. Anjikuni Lake is located in the remote northern region of Canada, in what is now called Nunavut. This area is extremely cold, especially during winter, and is very far from large cities or towns. In the early 1900s, Inuit people lived in small communities across this region. These communities were not like modern towns with permanent buildings. Most Inuit families lived a nomadic or semi-nomadic life. This means they moved from place to place depending on the season, the weather, and the availability of food such as fish, caribou, and seals. Because of this lifestyle, villages were sometimes empty for long periods. The story begins in the early 1930s with a man named Joe LaBelle. According to newspapers, Joe LaBelle was a fur trader who traveled through northern Canada by dog sled. Traders like him were common during that time. They visited Inuit communities to trade goods such as fur, tools, food supplies, and other items. The story says that when LaBelle arrived at a small Inuit village near Anjikuni Lake, he noticed something very strange. The village, which he had visited before, was completely empty. Not a single person was there. Newspaper reports claimed that LaBelle found houses standing but abandoned. Inside the homes, cooking pots were still on the fire, as if people had left suddenly in the middle of preparing a meal. Clothing, tools, and weapons were said to be left behind. This was considered strange because Inuit people depended heavily on their tools to survive the harsh Arctic environment. Leaving them behind would have been dangerous and unlikely. The story also said that the village dogs were found dead from starvation, tied to posts, which made the situation even more disturbing. One of the most frightening parts of the story involved the village graveyard. Some versions of the story claimed that the graves had been opened and bodies were missing. This detail added a strong sense of horror and mystery. Because of these shocking claims, the story spread quickly. People began to believe that something terrible and unknown had happened. Some suggested that the villagers were kidnapped. Others believed they were killed by a strange disease, attacked by unknown enemies, or taken by supernatural forces. As the story became more popular, more dramatic details were added. Some later versions claimed that strange lights were seen in the sky around the time the village disappeared. Others said that a sudden and extreme cold wave froze the area instantly. There were even claims that the villagers were taken by aliens. These ideas made the story exciting, but they were based on imagination, not evidence. To understand whether this incident was real, historians and researchers later examined the facts. One of the most important findings is that there are no official records supporting the story as it is commonly told. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, who would have investigated such a serious event, stated that there were no records of an investigation into a missing village at Anjikuni Lake. No official police reports, government documents, or detailed witness statements exist to confirm that an entire village vanished overnight. Another important point is that early newspaper reporting was often unreliable. In the early 20th century, newspapers competed for readers. Sensational stories sold more papers, so journalists sometimes exaggerated events or published stories without carefully checking the facts. Remote regions like northern Canada were especially easy to misreport because few people could verify what really happened. Once a dramatic story was printed, other newspapers often repeated it, making it seem more believable over time. Researchers also looked into the existence of the village itself. While Inuit people did live around Anjikuni Lake, there is no clear evidence that a large permanent village existed there exactly as described. Most Inuit communities were small and moved seasonally. A trading post might be empty simply because people had gone elsewhere to hunt or fish. To an outsider like a trader, an empty settlement could appear mysterious even if it was normal for the local people. The claim about dogs being found dead is also questionable. Dogs were extremely valuable to Inuit families because they were used for transportation. Leaving dogs tied up to starve would make no sense. Historians believe this detail was likely added later to make the story more shocking. Similarly, the story about open graves has no physical or written evidence to support it. No archaeologists or officials have ever confirmed disturbed graves at Anjikuni Lake. One of the strongest explanations for the incident is that the villagers simply moved. Inuit life depended on following food sources. If fish were no longer available in one area or if caribou migrated elsewhere, families would pack their belongings and relocate. Sometimes they left behind items that were too heavy or broken to carry. Cooking pots left behind could have been old or unused. Fires described as still burning may have been an exaggeration or misunderstanding. Another possible explanation is disease. In the early 1900s, diseases such as influenza and tuberculosis affected many indigenous communities in Canada. If people became sick, they may have traveled to other areas to seek help or join relatives. However, even this explanation does not support the idea of a sudden, mysterious disappearance overnight. It suggests a gradual movement, not a supernatural event. The Anjikuni Lake story is an example of how legends are created. A simple situation, an empty settlement, may have been misunderstood. That misunderstanding was then turned into a dramatic story by newspapers. Over time, as people retold the story, it became more frightening and mysterious. Each retelling added new details, making it sound more like a horror story than a historical event. It is also important to consider how indigenous people were portrayed in old stories. Inuit culture and ways of life were often misunderstood by outsiders. Nomadic movement was sometimes described as strange or suspicious by people who did not understand it. This lack of understanding contributed to the mystery surrounding the story. What was normal behavior for Inuit families may have seemed unexplainable to traders or journalists. In modern times, historians agree that the Anjikuni Lake mystery is mostly a myth. While Inuit people lived in the area and traders did travel through it, there is no proof that a whole village vanished suddenly and mysteriously. There is also no evidence of a large tragedy or supernatural event. The most reasonable conclusion is that the story was exaggerated and misunderstood from the beginning. Despite this, the story remains popular. People are naturally drawn to mysteries, especially ones involving disappearances. The idea of a whole village vanishing overnight is frightening and fascinating. Movies, books, and videos continue to repeat the story because it captures attention. Even when experts explain that it is not true, the legend lives on. In simple terms, the Anjikuni Lake incident did not happen the way it is usually described. A village did not vanish without explanation. There were no confirmed empty houses with food cooking, no starving dogs tied to posts, and no open graves. What likely happened was that Inuit families moved according to their traditional way of life, and their absence was later turned into a sensational mystery story. The lesson from this incident is important. Not every dramatic story is true. It is always necessary to check evidence, official records, and historical context. Legends often grow when facts are mixed with fear, imagination, and misunderstanding. The Anjikuni Lake story reminds us how easily myths can become truth when they are repeated often enough. In conclusion, the disappearing village of Anjikuni Lake is best understood as a legend based on exaggeration rather than a real mystery. While the story is interesting and spooky, it should not be considered a confirmed historical event. Understanding the real history of Inuit life and the way stories were told in the past helps us see the truth more clearly.